Okay. I want to welcome everybody to this press conference. I'm Bob Woodson, the president and founder of the Woodson Center. We're sponsoring the 1776 gathering today. We also want to welcome our new partner, the Washington Examiner. They will be publishing our essays on their website starting today, one a day for the next 12 days. And they have a wonderful editorial today. We also, all of our essays are listed on our website, 1776unites.com. You can read the essays. I also want to thank our sponsors, Greg Coons, who couldn't be here but has a representative, and also Jim Forrest, who's one of our great supporters, enabled us to do this. The reason that we're gathered to address the 1619 project, the good news is that it has stimulated a much-needed debate within the black community. The quality of life in the black community has been served over the past 2 centuries with the quality of the debate within. During the 19th century, latter 19th century, there were 3 areas. One, there were those who believe in recolonization, that we should return to Africa. This was briefly embraced by President Lincoln, but the greatest advocate was Marcus Garvey. The second were insurrectionists, and they were for violence, Nat Turner, remember. And the third were accommodationists, Booker T. Washington and others. And this debate within the black community served us well. And then 20th century, that debate occurred with the civil rights movement. People don't realize, but in the 60s, we had our own Tea Party movement within the civil rights movement, when everybody at first thought we should have a legal challenge to segregation. And when the students at Greenboro believed that the pace wasn't aggressive enough, they started the sit-ins, and Dr. King was dispatched from Atlanta to discourage those students from doing that. And they said to him, lead, follower, get out the way. And so Dr. King then, but the leadership didn't embrace it. But then, so that was one of the currents. We also then, you saw the splintering of the civil rights movement, SNCC, SCLC, because of these different divisions about how we should pursue the path forward. And then you had your insurrectionists, the Black Panther Party, the Republic of New Africa, who believed we should have a separate state within the United States. You had Malcolm X, Elijah Muhammad, but there was a healthy debate. In the last 50 years, there has been no debate in the black community. And we hope that 1776 will spark this kind of competition of ideas and approaches. And so, but what we are troubled about 1619 is that it defines America as being incurably racist. And very simply put, that all white people are beneficiaries of privilege and also are victimizers, and all blacks are victims. And this negative message is dangerous to the future because it discourages black. Nothing is more lethal than a good excuse for failing. And that's our inner cities are ablaze, toxic drugs and predatory violence. But 1619 says that these conditions were spawned by slavery in the shadow of Jim Crow. But this is patently untrue. If that were the case, the fact that more blacks are killed by other blacks today than were killed over a 50-year period by the Klan. We have a 9/11 every 6 months. That condition did not exist prior to the 1960s. And so our essays will bear out the truth. And the truth is that Black America's future was never defined by oppression. It was defined by our response to oppressive circumstances. In other words, when white people were at their worst, we were at our best. When we were denied access to hotels, we built our own. The Wallahaji in Atlanta, the St. Teresa in in New York, the St. Charles in Chicago. When we were denied access to business in the Brownsville section of Chicago, there were 731 businesses owned by blacks in the city of Chicago and $100 million in real estate assets. Between 1930 and 1940, when de jure segregation was the rule of law and no political representation, when the unemployment rate in the black community was 40%, we did not respond to that oppression by killing ourselves. In fact, the marriage rate was higher than any other group in America because of our strong Christian values, exercised control over elderly people could walk safely in our communities without fear of being mugged by their grandchildren. Yes. Poverty lowered between 1940 and 1960 from 82% down to 40%. We were well on the way of mending ourselves. So the reality is, if Black America is defined not by America's birth defect of slavery, but is defined by the promise that America, if we were to abide by the principles, the direction given us by 1619, what they're saying is that America is an evil empire, that America does not deserve to be supported because its fundamental principles are corrupt and hypocritical. And what they really are saying to the thousands and thousands of black who gave their lives in the military defending this nation, that their sacrifice was for naught, defending a corrupt. And we reject this notion. We also believe that if these policies go unchallenged, it has serious implications for our national security. Because if you're saying, as 3,000 schools now have been given this disastrous curriculum developed, and so can you imagine a 10-year-old child, black child, growing up for 8 years bombarded with anti-American propaganda? They are going to be called upon to join the military to defend. Why would you want to defend a nation that you've been told is corrupt and immoral? They're not going to be willing to be joining the police force to protect us. So it is important for this narrative to be challenged. But we are not going to engage in political debate. Americans are tired of gladiatorial combat. What we are offering at 1776 is an aspirational and an inspirational alternative narrative to what people are offering. And our scholars here and our activists, the doers and the activists, have come together because our activists are living examples of the founders' principles, and their actions have served to transform inner city communities. And so, so what we're going to do is I'm going to ask some of them to come up and share their essays with us, and so that you can give some details. We hope to develop curriculum so that we can present to our K through 12, our children, an alternative. People are inspired, ladies and gentlemen, to achieve when they are given victories that are possible, not always showering them with injuries to be avoided. And this garbage that is coming down from the scholars and writers from 1619, it's most hypocritical because they don't live in communities suffering the problem. So they're advocating something that they don't have to pay the penalty for. And so we believe that we're creating a kind of intellectual ghetto by already telling kids who are in underperforming schools, the reason that they are mugging and killing each other is because it's not your fault. It's racism. If you're having babies out of wedlock, it's not your fault. And right now, we're seeing a disaster about these killings. In St. Louis this spring, we had 16 children under the age of 14 murdered on the streets by other blacks, and only one arrest. But the writers of 1619, they don't have families living in those toxic neighborhoods. And so what we want to present is an uplifting story of, I just wanted uplifting stories in our essays about how people are achieving against the odds so that we can inspire this nation. And again, we are delighted that we have an opportunity to offer a competitive alternative. It's not enough to tell people what not to read and not to study, but one must give them an alternative to say, pointing to what you should study and what you should memory. We're also pleased to have in our group Stephanie Deutsch, who has a book on Rosenwald schools. Her husband is the great-grandson of Julius Rosenwald, who, with Booker T. Washington, established the Rosenwald schools that closed the education gap in the South between 1920 and 1940. It was 8 years for whites and 5 years for blacks. And they closed that gap within 6 months, within 20 years. If racism were the culprit, how did we achieve in the presence of those circumstances? So we're going to be presenting other aspects. I'm going to ask right now Dr. Glenn Lowry to step up and offer some comments to us.
Thank you, Bob. I'm Glenn Lowry. I'm the Merton Stoltz Professor of the Social Sciences at Brown University. I have been a friend of Bob Woodson's and a collaborator for 35 years, and I'm very happy to be associated with this project. I won't take a long time to say again what Bob just said, but I'm here for 2 reasons. I believe in America, and I believe in black people. Something tells me when I read that document that the 1619 Project authors don't. They don't believe in America. We're not a city on a hill. We're not a light unto the nations. And I'm sorry to have to report, I get the impression that they don't believe in black people. I'll be brief. This great nation abolished slavery. Slavery was a fact of human civilization since antiquity. Abolition is the new idea. And that is a Western idea. Not possible without the democratic institutions that were built in 1776. Not possible without the ideals of the Enlightenment that were actually embodied in political institutions in 1776. There's a reason why democracies that have come along in the 200-odd years since have often sought to model their constitutions on the documents that were created in the era of 1776. So I believe in America, not perfect, but perfectible. And I believe in black people. Slavery was a long time ago. The idea that the specter of slavery still determines the character of life amongst African Americans is an affront to me. We have shown, and will continue to show, that we are not merely baubles at the end of a historical string, being pushed this way and that by forces beyond our control. We can raise our children. We can educate them. We can build businesses and create wealth. We can conduct ourselves in a manner that deserves to be honored and emulated by others. And I believe that this project, the 1776 project, is an essential step in that direction. Thank you. I'm going to have to sit.
Okay, go ahead. I want to introduce now Ian Rowe.
Good afternoon. It is humbling and honored to be here. In the mid-1960s, my parents immigrated from Jamaica to the United States with their 2 sons. They had some trepidation because they fully understood the history of this country. They were fully aware of America's legacy of slavery, and they knew that we would have to confront and eventually overcome issues of race. But they also knew something else. They believed in this idea of the American dream. They believed that despite this nation's history, their two children could pursue a better life. And because of my parents' love, their example, their 48 years of marriage before my dad passed away, and because of the incredible opportunities I've experienced in this exceptional country, my mom can literally watch me now and see the embodiment of what she and my dad dreamed up many years ago. And for the last 10 years, I've run a network of public charter schools in the heart of the South Bronx and the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Our more than 2,000 students are primarily Black and Hispanic, almost all from low-income communities. The dreams that the parents in the schools that I lead have the same aspirations for their children that my parents had for me. They don't believe that their kids are doomed because of America's past. On the contrary, they choose our schools because we build within them a sense of what is possible. The last thing our kids need to hear is that they are in a perpetual state of victimhood. I'm incredibly honored to be part of 1776 because it is the future of the next generation that matters more than, in fact, what we believe in the past. Our kids ultimately will succeed not because they've developed a mindset around enslavement. Rather, we need to liberate the next generation to share innumerable stories of success so they develop a sense of empowerment. Thank you.
Now we have a very exciting young man, Coleman Hughes, who's a student at Columbia University and a prolific writer and one of our rising stars.
Thank you, Bob. I don't have time to share my entire essay, but I just have a few brief comments. The question we're here to ask today is, what makes America unique? Put differently, if you were to view every nation on Earth in an anonymous lineup, how would you be able to tell which one is America? Increasingly, our most revered journalistic institutions and universities seem to answer in one voice: oppression. Racism, it is often said, is, quote, in our DNA. It is said to be our essential characteristic as a country. You could pick out America in a lineup, they seem to say, because of our tendency to exploit the weak, to excuse the sins of the strong, and to value profit over humanity. Today, we are challenging that false narrative. Any argument that says America is defined by racism and white supremacy must explain why America is the #1 destination for Black and brown migrants all over the world. Any argument that says the Constitution was nothing special must explain why fledgling nations all over the world have copied it. Any argument that says the institution of slavery is what makes America unique must grapple with the fact that slavery was practiced in almost every society on Earth until just a few centuries ago, as well as the fact that most of those societies have done far less than America has to acknowledge and atone for it. To point to America's worst sins is to point out what is least unique about us and to pass it off as our defining feature. America is far from perfect, but to say this is to point out a banality. Nothing man-made ever has been or ever will be perfect. Our challenge is to make incremental progress, to create, as it were, a more perfect union. We can either raise the next generation of Americans to see the country's worst sins as its defining feature, and therefore to see the American experiment as corrupt in principle. Or we can teach them to see the country as it is. We can teach them to see the country that migrants all over the world leave everything behind for. In other words, we can teach them how to pick America out in a lineup. Thank you.
Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce my longtime friend, Clarence Page. He's no stranger to anyone in Washington or the country.
Thank you very much, Bob. I'm not going to read my whole essay here either. You all can do that at your leisure. But I just want to say how I came to be involved with this. Great thing about being a journalist is sometimes you run across a story that really has a tangible effect on your own life. And that was how it was when I met Bob Woodson some 30-odd years ago. And it's like, one thing about him is I was also working on a panel show at BET called Lead Story at the time. And I used to call it the Black Men's McLaughlin Group. But it was one that we talked, Glenn knows what I'm talking about. And one thing that was always a nagging point of discussion for us was, where is our agenda as a people? Ever since the 60s, our need for a new agenda was very apparent, but trying to bring people together around certain points was very difficult. And this brings me to the 1619 project, or in the 1776 project, because one of our big questions was, what do we do now? And one thing Bob Woodson said to me was, well, he quoted Abraham Maslow, if the only tool you have is a hammer, all problems begin to look like nails. And the application was very obvious. If the only tool we have is civil rights, which of course is a wonderful tool to have when appropriate, everything begins to look like a civil rights problem. And you cannot fight everything out in the courts. You also need to build some problems from the build some solutions from the grassroots. You need to go to the people who are really being directly affected by the problems and see what they think needs to be done. Then put that together with what you find other people would like to do, and you see where you can meet together on common ground, something that's a geographic place that's kind of unknown in Washington these days. But common ground's a nice place to be. When you go through history, you find that that's where we move ahead. So I was very disturbed when the 1619 project, for example, gave the impression that white people didn't have anything to do with the liberation of black people, as if there weren't any white people in the abolitionist movement. I think Frederick Douglass would be very upset to see that kind of impression, that kind of a message being given out. And I see a lot of stories all the time, and I was telling Bob about how I was surprised while I was trying to figure out how President Donald Trump had defied my predictions and actually won the election, that I was directed by several friends to, why don't you read a book called Hillbilly Elegy by a guy named J.D. Vance, about poor white people in Appalachia. And I picked it up, and I was surprised to notice that J.D. Vance and I have the same hometown, Middletown, Ohio. Yeah. Only I'm just about 3.5 decades ahead of him. But I had life better for me because we were there in the last great days of post-war productivity. Great steel town, classic Ohio factory town that over time, with the changes in the economy, changes in politics and all, in more recent years, it went from being an all-American city to being known as having one of the worst opiate addiction and overdose problems in the country. I was shocked to find in 2017 that my hometown's city budget, 10% of it the previous year had gone to ambulance calls. And that's the sign of complete deterioration, degradation, breakdown in community. And I have another unusual friend, Charles Murray, who I first met Charles Murray, became, well, actually back in the 80s. Anyhow, I love turning short stories into long ones, so please forgive me. But I just want to say, I was upset with Charles for various flaws I saw in The Bell Curve, which he co-authored. But in 2011, he came out with a new book called Coming Apart, which focused only on poor white people. He got so much heat for talking about race. He said, I'm going to do a book about poverty without talking about race. So we'll just focus on the white people. I say, Charles, I love you. Because he made so many points in this book that I've been saying for years, that white folks have the same poverty problems as black folks. We just got a different skin color, basically. I call it the colorization of poverty. when I was a kid back in the early 60s, and Johnson's LBJ started the War on Poverty, and I was an upward bound worker there a couple years later. It was a time when poverty had a white face, a white Appalachian face. And then after Watts, poverty became black. You can see it in Life magazines, Saturday Evening Post, Look, publications for you young people that were very popular once in America. And that was where we got the visuals, the visual profile of America. And we're still in that stage today. When you say poverty, so many folks think of a black face. They don't see that we have problems across the line. I'll talk with J.D. Vance, and we've compared notes, and we could see that indeed we do have a common ground, and that is we all want to have a more productive America. We want to see that American dream revived. For so many folks, that American dream is just a fantasy. But to me, that's what, talk about aspirational. To me, that's what the Declaration of Independence is about. I just came back from Monticello, another long story I won't go into. But that's why I love the literature that just as yes, I'm going to wrap this up, but just as Thurgood Marshall, just as Thurgood Marshall refused to celebrate the bicentennial of the Constitution, but he did celebrate the improved Constitution, because the original Constitution wasn't perfect, but it had the mechanism for its own improvement. And that is where I am today, ladies and gentlemen. I feel like we all know where we stand now. We are all aware of common ground. We need to talk about how can we move forward together. And thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you. Thanks. Next, I want to introduce Dr. John Sibley Butler, longtime friend and probably the nation's foremost experts on the history of blacks in business. Many years ago, we sponsored his research, and we published a magazine with pictures of 4 black men in Durham, North Carolina, in their 90s. All of them had retired from their own businesses. And it was John Butler who found them and wrote about them, and I'd like to ask John to come up and offer his remarks.
Thank you very much, Bob. As Bob said, I came here some 30 years ago and said, my interest is in the relationship between innovation and entrepreneurship and success among blacks. Bill Raspberry, former columnist and Gone to Glory, was there, and he said, you better document everything because nobody will believe it. I did a book called Entrepreneurship and Self-Help Among Black Americans, looking at that relationships. I'm a Southern Louisiana boy that grew up with all kinds of great aspirations, surrounded by Dillard University, Southern University, Xavier University, 4th generation college graduate. My question has always been, what's the algorithm for black success? I traced this success beginning in the early 1700s by great scholars such as W.B. Du Bois' Economic Cooperation Among Negroes. Being a scholar, I also look at all of the work done on the Negro college graduates since its inception. And right now, I'm doing a book now on the relationship between the Roosevelt schools and success in America. So basically, if we look at that algorithm, what do we talk about? As Bob has noted, as we've noted some 35 or 40 years ago, the whole idea of looking at success and having a future is very, very important. So I can remember Bob's work in St. Louis. I can remember us talking about how do we really, really change what they call the inner cities. Well, all black Americans are not inner city blacks. As I said, I'm a 4th generation college graduate, 4th generation success, and how did that happen? So the algorithm then is to concentrate on changing the narrative, first of all, about what America is about. As Bob said, it's the inspirations of black America, it's the inspirations how we create institutions and organizations. Atlanta is very, very difficult, but different from Detroit because of the black population. Nashville is different than Detroit because of the success of the black population. People have to confuse segregation with homophily. Beneath the laws of segregation was a whole can-do spirit. As Margaret Levinstein noted in her work on the census and black entrepreneurship, in 1910 census, black were more likely to be self-employed than any other group in America. Beyond homophily was the development of private schools and public schools, whether it was Morehouse, whether it was Spelman. So therefore, by the 1960s, if you will, black Southerners were more likely to be black Southerners were more likely to be college graduates than anybody in the country. And that because it was an emphasis on homophily, an emphasis on the whole idea of coming together. If you have a problem, let's start a school. If you have a problem in the community, let's solve it ourselves. When I did my research in Durham, North Carolina, and talking to those black traditions there, I said, how did you create such an entrepreneurial spirit in the 1920s and the 1930s? They said, well, we solved all our problems by not asking white America what they did to us. So I think this is in line with our group that's really, really interested in coming to America and saying the following. There's no other country in America with this tradition of giving people an opportunity to move from point A to point B. And in my opinion, when I look at the work that I'm doing now on the algorithm for success, there's nothing like the relationship between innovation, entrepreneurship, self-employment, and creating a future for future generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, we want to introduce Jason Hill, who will offer some remarks on his essay and his work.
I think, my name is Jason Hill, and I think that the 1619 Project, like every project, presupposes an answer to the question, what is the moral meaning of a phenomenon? And the 1619 Project offers an indictment of the United States of America, a country that I think is the greatest, most unprecedented phenomenon that has ever existed. I came to this country as an immigrant with $120 in my pocket and went on to become a college professor and the author of many books. And in my latest book, We Have Overcome, I sought to, at the time I didn't realize it, but I was answering a question to the 1619 Project, what is the moral meaning of America? And in that book, I sought to give an answer, and that answer is America is an ethical state. And why do I say America is an ethical state? It ties it back to the 1776 Project. America is an ethical state because, and I make the claim that race was always endemic to this country, but race was metaphysically irrelevant to the construction of this country. And the reason I say that race was metaphysically and continues to be metaphysically irrelevant to the meaning of America is that I realized early on from the Constitution that race would never, ever be something, a phenomenon that would determine black people's fate and destiny irrevocably. And so what I'm doing in my work is showing that there was something in that document that provided the emancipatory and provided not just the emancipatory, but provided the tools for the inclusion of black people into what I call the domain of the ethical, into the widening pantheon of the human community, so that blacks and other minorities would suffuse the American landscape with narratives of their own and continue to expand this wonderful experiment, which is not a hermetically sealed phenomenon, but an open-ended system, and that the voices of black people and that the lives and agency of black people would continue to be a constitutive feature of this great republic of ours. The 1619 Project would have us believe that blacks are not part of the moral meaning of America. And what my project is partly doing is rendering that piece of nonsense as what it is, nonsense, that black people, whether they were slaves or entrepreneurs or crop-sharing farmers, have always contributed to the moral meaning of this country. America exists as a possibilities of full disclosures or disclosure of possibilities. It's an aspirational country, and blacks have always pinned their aspirations on the best in America. It's a call for the best within us, and it's a call for us to exercise or moral excellence. And that's just a little bit of what I'm doing in my project. Thank you.
And now, Dr. Carol Swain, who will come and share her very exciting paper.
I'm Carol Swain, and I'm a former professor of political science and law at Vanderbilt University, and I was also a tenured professor at Princeton. I've known and admired Bob for more than 30 years, and the essay that I wrote for this project is titled Critical Race Theory and Its Destructive Impact on America. It's an essay that you can read. I believe that what I have to offer that's most important for this 1776 project is my life story of having been a high school dropout, one of 12 children born and raised in rural poverty. I dropped out after the 8th grade. I married at 16. By the time I was 21, I had 3 small children. I earned a GED, went to a community college, and got the first of 5 degrees. I was able to graduate magna cum laude from my 4-year college. People came into my life, and people came into my life, and the ones that took an interest in me and steered me forward, they were white, and many of them were white men. And these people encouraged me that I could do anything, and I did not see myself as handicapped because I was black, I was a female, I was poor. I didn't see any of that until I got to graduate school. And then I learned that I was oppressed, that I was poor, that I was black, that I was a female, and that I couldn't do any of the things that I had already done. And so I believe the 1619 Project offers a very crippling message to our children. And I was spared from having that message brought to me. And I believe that if I had been exposed to that, if I had internalized that negative message, I don't believe I would have been able to do the things that I've done in life. I believe in America. I believe America is the greatest country in the world. I'm a patriot. I want to do everything that I can for this nation to bring it together. And I think that we do need to learn to love and respect each other. And this negativity that's seeping into our schools, that's teaching for one thing, white children are being shamed. They're being told to be ashamed of themselves because of the color of their skin, and black children are told that because of structural discrimination that they can't. We have to counter that. We are at an important tipping point in this nation. What we do matters, and I believe that the 1776 project, that this project is an important historical moment, and we need people to get behind us. We need to make sure that our message reaches white, black, Asian, Hispanic, everyone. America is a great country, and we need to fight for it. Thank you.
I'm glad I'm not following, Carol. We now want to hear from Talib Sparks. Where's Starks? I'm sorry.
Thank you. Greetings. I'm Talib Starks, and don't let the nice suit fool you. I'm from the hood in Philadelphia. Actually, I'm from 2 hoods. The first hood is an environment where criminality and violence litter the landscape. It's a place where homicide is the #1 killer of black males between the ages of 15 and 34. The second hood is just as dangerous, and I would it's arguable that it's more detrimental to one's well-being and development because it kills dreams and aspirations. Now, that hood that I'm talking about is victimhood, specifically racial victimhood. And this hood is being force-fed to us and peddled by a racial grievance industry, whereas the physical hood is being sustained, and which essentially is a byproduct of leftist policies, but that's another story for another day. Anyway, on this Valentine's Day, the 1776 Project is bringing a message of love. Yes. And sometimes love can hurt, like the truth. Yes. And here's a truth that may be hurtful to some people's ears, these people who have agendas. America is not a racist labyrinth that's specifically designed to stifle the advancement of black people. And our police are not badged boogeymen who, as they are often made out to be. So with God's help, this 1776 project will indeed break the gravitational pull of racial victimhood that seems to be omnipresent in this great country. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I want to bring Wilfred Riley up to offer.
Hi. So I'm Will Riley. I'm an associate professor of politics at Kentucky State University, and I'm the author of the books Hate, Crime, Hoax, and Taboo. Glad to be here as one of many people representing the 1776 project. Thanks, I do have a nice natural baritone, as well as a nice natural tan. But so, back up a little bit. I don't think I need the mic, honestly, in a room this size. But so the title of my essay is Slavery Doesn't Define African American History, something I believe to be obviously true. And in the full piece, and obviously these, as have been noted, are several pages long scholarly pieces, thanks to the Washington Examiner for publishing this series over a series of days. But the piece breaks this down in some detail. But a couple of quick notes. I mean, slavery obviously is a human universal. People of every race were sold as slaves, although for whatever reason this is not taught very often in the schools. There was an entire slave trade, the Barbary slave trade, that focused entirely on the sale of white Europeans to primarily Moorish and black masters in northern Africa. In a sentence, slavery existed everywhere in the world until the modern West stopped it around the 1850s. So that's point one. A second point from the essay is that obviously, given that we have no slaves today, there was an anti-slavery movement in the United States for roughly the same duration of time as there was slavery, and this movement won in the end. This was a movement made up of many black and white people of goodwill. And as most things do, the campaign against slavery proceeded incrementally. I mean, in 1808, for example, a law was passed prohibiting the importation of slaves, essentially crippling the Atlantic slave trade. Finally, obviously, it can't be forgotten that we freed the slaves in the United States at terrible cost. During the Civil War, about 600,000 Americans, most of the men of the North, were killed. I did the calculations on the back of a playing card deck coming here, and that was one for every 9.2 slaves freed. So if the USA owed a bill for slavery, you can argue that we, black and white, have both already paid it in blood. So all of this is discussed in the essay. One final point in the piece is that many modern black problems seem to have very little to do with slavery and a great deal to do with the social revolution of the 1960s. And the clearest evidence I can find of this is that they're mirrored among our white countrymen. So in 1938, for example, according to the economist Walter Williams, the illegitimacy rate, if you want to use that term, for African Americans was 11%. Now, admittedly, in a sort of healthy competition, it was only 4% for whites, so good for Caucasian Americans as well. But the illegitimacy rate currently is 74% for African Americans. It's 37% for white Americans. It's around 55% for Hispanic Americans, around 60% for Native Americans, and I believe 42.3% for the entire country, regardless of color. This is a national universal problem that clearly, by definition, has nothing to do with slavery. I suspect that if you look at opiate abuse in poor white communities or gang violence in African American neighborhoods, those are things that on both sides are far, far, far more serious than they ever were when we were actually fighting one another in the streets. We can't make excuses. We just need to work together and solve these problems. So I note this in the piece. And finally, without going through the entire article, I'm a supporter of the 1776 project for one simple reason. I think some things are commonsensical, obvious truths that you've heard from athletic coaches and preachers and mothers and fathers your entire life. One of those is that the United States of America, while it has flaws, is a pretty good society if you look at freedoms or income or virtually anything else on a global basis. It is not especially hard to succeed in the United States of America. People regularly come from countries where, without any mockery at all, cars are a luxury item, Ethiopia and Vietnam and so forth, and outperform much of the native population of the USA. And I think that this is possible for anyone of any color in the United States of America, given personal responsibility and hard work. There's absolutely no reason whatsoever that middle-class African Americans or our Appalachian countrymen should be held to a lower standard than recent immigrants from the developing world. That is racism. And that is my essay.
I went down here from Natasha Fields.
Hello, yes, I'm Latasha Fields, and I am just honored to be here. And I was asked, why am I supporting 1776? Well, I stand here and I call myself the younger generation to represent that America is a great country. And I have been able and fortunate to connect with Bob Whoops and so many wonderful people that stand behind me, and also have been fortunate to testify before the U.S. Congress about economic poverty in this country. And what I stand to say, I stood to say then, we can achieve through hard work, perseverance. I was a 17-year-old mom, a teen mom, and again, I stand here today as a married woman, almost 15 years with 4 children. I stand as an advocate for quality education. I am also a 13-year homeschool mom. So you can't tell me 1619 what we can't do in this country. You cannot tell me the liberties and the freedoms that has been afforded to my family. And when it comes to African-American history or black history, I teach my children, I have been teaching them for 13 years, that is not black history, it's not white history, it is American history. The good, the bad, and the ugly, we're one. And they will learn the truth. And so I thank God for this opportunity to be a part of such phenomenal people. And as we come together and as we embrace the truth, and like Mr. Woodson continued to tell us, not to debate, but to have an alternative. We all stand here today as an alternative. And we all look black. Well, some of us. Some of us. So we are the alternative. And our children can succeed. They can be successful. And I've been showing my children, and we've been doing it since 1642. Amen. Amen. And so we can succeed in this country. And so again, I just thank God to be a part of such a beautiful, beautiful project. And I just want to tell my family and friends and my people, this country, we love you. We love our children. We love our youth. And every parent wants the best for their children. Amen.
Thank you. And now before introducing our last presenter, before we take questions, just want to acknowledge in the room the presence of one of our leaders, Mr. Tyrone Parker, who's the president of Alliance of Concerned Men in the back. And Tyrone and his group, over many decades, as ex-offenders themselves, have witnessed to ex-gang members and brought about peace in these communities through just the will and determination to do so. And he and Carl Hodrick and Curtis Watkins and others who are part of the Woodson family, we just praise you and thank you for being a part of it. Another one of those neighborhood healing agents, as I call him, is Tony McElwain, whom I've known for 4 decades. He's one of our star leaders in the city of Detroit. And I want her to give remarks, and then we'll take questions.
Okay, my name is Tony McElwain from the east side of Detroit, and I'm talking about an area that's 80 to 85% at or below the poverty level. What did I do? I went and lived in that community, and I decided that we are better than what people said we were. And I took that community and I developed block clubs, I developed neighborhoods, they cleaned up that community, they went back to school. We were able to reduce the crime by 40% in 2 years. 40%, because we were able to do that. There's one thing that I noticed that on one of Bob's letters that he sent me, is that God do not select the capable. He select those and make them capable. And I was grateful for that because I saw a neighborhood transform from a deteriorating neighborhood to a livable neighborhood. But not only did I see the neighborhood transform, I saw a residence of a neighborhood, 50 blocks, 5,000 residents lived in that area. And they are now called the heroes of their own families. And I'm grateful for that. Why do I select, or why do I think the 1776 is important? Why do I think that? Because we're part of it. We are what we are supposed to be, where we can lift our own selves up by our own bootstraps. And I'm glad that I was able to lift myself up and to show to other people in that community that they too can lift themselves up. So, Bob, I want to thank you for what you have done, bringing us together, because, by God, we are the incapable, able to be capable of changing our own neighborhoods. Thank you.
We'll be glad to take whatever questions you may have. Any questions? Any other questions? Yes. Yeah, you can come to the mic.
This isn't necessarily directed at any specific person, but it's maybe a thought that I was kind of wondering if the presenters had in general, which was that, do any of you think that we're at a point where, in terms of elections, things like that, we're past the point where we just talk about the black vote as this monolithic thing, as if every black person's going to vote the same way in an election? That was what Joe Biden still is banking on, is this idea of having 40% of the black vote or whatever. That started to deteriorate over time. Do you think that we're at a point where there's enough economic, social diversity among black people in this country at this point where you're not going to be able to just say, oh, well, the black vote is going to go to this or that candidate? Is there enough diversity of opinion? Is there enough diversity of lifestyle that those days are over, do you think?
Well, we are trying to, with 1776, to present to the country, and particularly black America, a reason to think more independently than what they've been told. It's not enough to talk. You can go to any city in the country, whether the governorship is controlled by Republicans or Democrats, the conditions of low-income people are all the same. The answers will not be found through electoral politics. But if I could speak politically for a second, my goal is not to recruit Republicans, make them Democrats. I want the black vote to be an independent swing voter. I want them to get sophisticated enough to vote their issues and to form strategic alliances. It's insulting when I see politicians say, well, all we got to do is go into a black audience and say, we're against racism. Vote for me.
I got something to say.
Yes.
Yeah, I think also if you look at the history, we made our best progress when we couldn't vote in terms of community. So I think what Bob is saying is that, what we're doing is concentrating, and everybody have their own individual aspiration of how they would like to vote. But it's not necessarily just on the established expectations, but a swing vote that's really, really related to the community where you are. But right now, there's no diversity in terms of viewing the black population. It's just being viewed as a monolithic kind of situation, right? But it's kind of where you are in life. I don't know if I'd rather vote or have the concession stand to sell the popcorn to people who are voting.
I would say that if we look at the public opinion polling, and if I were to look at the black youth and people that I talk with, I don't believe the black vote is monolithic. I believe that black people have reached the point where they're looking around and their votes are up for grabs. But in this next election, if I were to make a prediction, I think that the Republicans and Donald Trump, and I know we're not supposed to be political, but I'm speaking as a political scientist now, I think that 20% of the black vote would be reasonable.
Yeah, just a quick comment on that in addition to Dr. Swain's. I'm a political scientist by background as well. I think this is really an empirical question. I mean, right now there are large, pretty well-funded movements like Blexit, where the goal is specifically moving African Americans away from sort of the mainstream of the Democratic Party. And I think that's something that a lot of people, you can wager on this on the site Bodog. This is something that a lot of people are very interested in seeing in progress. Will that happen? So that's an empirical question. I do think that there's an interesting background here, and that if you look at, for example, church-going, or attitudes toward issues like quote-unquote transgender rights, the African-American community is a fairly conservative community. More conservative than most Caucasian communities, large majority. What you've seen is that African Americans have become an 80 to 90% Democratic voting wheelhouse basically because of the use of the race narrative. That's an empirical fact. I mean, Joe Biden running against Mitt Romney, who's one of the most milquetoast, moderate individuals you can imagine, the anti-racist hit of Bain, said that he was quote-unquote going to put African Americans back in chains. And this was said to a large black audience, easily searchable on Google. There were cheers. That's how you've managed to get 86% of the black vote very consistently. Will that continue? We'll see. I mean, there's a concerted backlash to change that right now, I will say. And that's being studied in political science.
Yeah, I think, yes. Before that, but the biggest barrier, even the whole voter suppression issue that's supposed to be popular. Well, it turns out that the states with the most restrictive voter laws has the highest black turnout. And also the biggest barrier to voting is apathy.
Right.
In the last mayor's race in Washington, D.C., in Ward 7 and 8, where it has all the problems, less than 6% of the people turned out. And this is a pattern in Newark, Trenton, other cities where Democrats have been in power. The turnout rate is apathy is the biggest barrier to people voting. So, but I just don't think the answer is through the electoral process. It's a cultural problem. It's an internal problem. Yeah, somebody had a question? Yes.
This is more nitty-gritty than an abstract question, but you mentioned the 1619 Project already has educational curriculum that's going to thousands of schools, and that you plan to do something in that area too. So where are those plans? What kind of materials would they be, and how would you get them to schools, and what's your time frame on that, Bob?
Our time frame, we planned to develop K through 12 curriculum. Joe Young is here from Hartford, Connecticut, one of the country's foremost cartoonists, not cartoonist, there's another more sophisticated animator. Woo, boy, let me get out of trouble on that. An animator to reach young people, and we're going to commission him to do an animation on 1776. We want to produce videos. I think the impact of your film on Clarence Thomas, that is premiere. We need hidden figures. I went to a gathering in Virginia, in Fredericksburg, Virginia, on a Saturday afternoon, where the author was there in an auditorium in a women's college. There were seats 1,000 people. There were 1,300, the fire marshal had to turn people away. Hundreds were turned away. Her book was sold out, and it was sold out in the local bookstore. 90% of the audience were black family members. So we really believe there is a thirst in America for virtue in action. And we want to use every means possible to develop a retail strategy. The problem with traditional ways, particularly if conservatives have of trying to push back against this, is to publish white papers and then argue it on talk radio. Well, we believe that that's insufficient and inadequate. So we hope to develop teachable, retail-oriented materials so we will have an alternative. The most popular book on Amazon in the socialist section is Communism for Kids. Yes, go ahead.
I sort of wanted to address the previous question that was asked about whether the black vote was monolithic. And I think it's not monolithic, but there's a sort of monolithicity to the black vote in relation to the Democratic Party. And if you look at the white women's vote in relation to Donald Trump, that is almost monolithic, I mean, compared to the black vote. And I think this is a larger issue about, without sounding condescending or patronizing, about sort of retraining the sensibilities of black voters in terms of their attitudes towards a savior complex. Because many black people have been fed a diet of victimology all their lives. And, you know, I'm not an activist, I'm an intellectual activist, I'm not a community activist or anything like that, but when I speak to black people, I say, no, look, white people are not coming to save you. You are responsible for your own fate, and your destiny lies in your hand, and the procreative choices that you make are your responsibility. And so I think conservatives have done speaking as an independent conservative, as a group, done a very, very poor job of communicating to black people and to the world in general. For example, the morality of capitalism. That capitalism doesn't lift people outside of poverty and doesn't only have practical benefits, but that capitalism is a moral system. And this message has got to be sent to blacks, that capitalism is something good. And we hear the idea that when black people vote for Republicans or vote conservative, that they're voting against their own economic self-interest. And I think they have to be divested of these kind of shibboleths, right? That they're not voting against their own economic self-interest when they're voting for a government that initiates tax cuts for small businesses that will then hire them and give them a break, and also give them a chance to start their own businesses. So I think this is a sort of educational process that conservatives should take very seriously. Whereas the Democrats turn up with a bunch of chicken wings and watermelons, slices like Mrs. Clinton did, right? And what else? And hot sauce, yes. The conservatives need to turn up with some ideological pamphlets and start teaching blacks about the moral basis of capitalism, that capitalism is a good moral thing in and of itself, aside from the practical results that it can deliver to their lives in terms of material benefits. Yeah.
Just in closing, I just want to add that America is in a moral and spiritual freefall. It is consuming people in different classes and different races. The very fact that in Palo Alto, Silicon Valley, that the suicide rate is 6 times the national average, when 90% of two-parent households where the parents have master's degrees. The crisis facing the emptiness of a 17-year-old daughter, the mother has to face that reality of her 17-year-old daughter. She has more in common with the 17-year-old black woman who lost her 17-year-old daughter to homicide in public housing. We need to address that lack of content and meaning in their lives. One is not insulated because of privilege, and one is not shielded because of injustice. That's why we are committed to taking race off of the table so that we can come together as Americans and address the lack of content and meaning in lives that are causing even affluent white kids to overdose on opiates. And so this is our task for 1776, and I want to thank all of you for coming, and this ends our press conference.